Hey guys, just to let you know that this episode is going to be mainly on the Zorro television series, and episode 2 will be on the Mask of Zorro. So I was going to try to do both on the same video, but said, well, why not just do it on the pilot episode first? So hope you guys enjoy. Here we go. Out of the night. Lightning strikes, and a Z shapes the night sky. Theme song. Do 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 do. Out of the night, when the full moon is bright, comes a horseman known as Zorro. This bold renegade carves a Z with his blade, a Z that stands for Zorro. Zorro, Zorro, the fox so cunning and free. Zorro, Zorro, who makes the shape with a sign with a Z. Welcome back to another episode of Movies and TVs on the Ball. My name is Steveo, your host, and on this episode, I am going to be taking a look at the swashbuckler himself before Jack Sparrow sailed the 7 seas and Batman took to the rooftops of Gotham City, or Spider-Man swung his web through New York. There was a man with a mask with a mark of the Z named Zorro. On this episode, I am going to take a look at the pilot episode of the Zorro television series, and then go straight into the Mask of Zorro. And the reason why I'm covering both is I figure, I knew of Zorro through the Mask of Zorro, but I didn't really know of Zorro through the television series until I actually saw Zorro on the Disney Channel late at night. And this time, this was before streaming, and they would have like the Disney, like, I don't know if it was the Wonderful World of Disney. They started doing like a weekly Disney, like 7, 6 Central or 8 o'clock. They would throw on, something like Toy Story or something from the 90s, like First Kid, Blank Check. Different films that you could probably find on Disney Plus today. And they would show that, and that would last, with probably commercials, about 2.5 hours. And then they would show, then it would be the Wonderful World of Disney, and if you remember that, it would show, I do remember seeing, episodes of the Mickey Mouse Club, old TV shows like, old TV shows from the 60s that Disney did, or Disney movies from the 60s. And these were kind of like from the vault of Disney. And, Walt Disney himself would show up and say, "Hello, I'm Walt Disney, and let's talk about this." And one of the shows I do remember kind of watching, like, late at night, on Disney Channel when, like, I would sneak out was Zorro. And so the reason why I'm covering this Zorro film is not necessarily because of the Disney Channel, but I'm more focusing right now on, since I'm talking about the Mask of Zorro, which I'll get to. One of the reasons why I chose the Mask of Zorro for this episode was Mask of Zorro, and I'll get into detail of it. But, Mask of Zorro came out when I was 10. It was one of really my first action-adventure PG-13 rated films that I got to watch without an adult, if you think about it. But I kind of was going to say, well, let's do the Mask of Zorro and talk about it. And then I found Zorro on Disney Plus, the black and white television series, and I thought, why don't I do kind of part one and part two? Being part one, I can talk about the Zorro television series, and then part two, I can discuss the Mask of Zorro. And so that's what I'm going to do. So the Mask of Zorro, the Zorro television series came out in 1957. It was 1957. It ran for 3 seasons and 39 episodes per season. I think, yeah, 39 episodes per season. So that's a lot of TV for each season. It was but only 4 episodes the third season. It was so Zorro was created by the Zorro was created by I actually did some research, and the Zorro creator, lightning strikes and a Z shapes the night sky. Theme song. Do 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 do. Out of the night when the full moon is bright comes a horseman known as Zorro. This bold renegade carves a Z with his blade, a Z that stands for Zorro. Zorro, Zorro, the fox so cunning and free. Zorro, Zorro, who makes the shape with a sign with a Z. Welcome back to another episode of Movies and TVs on the Ball. My name is Steveo, your host, and on this episode, I am going to be taking a look at the swashbuckler himself before Jack Sparrow sailed the 7 seas and Batman took to the rooftops of Gotham City, or Spider-Man swung his web through New York. There was a man with a mask with a mark of the Z named Zorro. On this episode, I am going to take a look at the pilot episode of the Zorro television series, and then go straight into the Mask of Zorro. And the reason why I'm covering both is we do see that when in the credits, the opening credits, he slices a Z in with the Z of his bounty. He has a secret identity of Don Diego de la Vega, and in the Zorro television series, he is played by Guy Williams. Now, Guy Williams is best known for his role. I did some research, and he was in the 1951 film The Day the Earth Stood Still as an uncredited role as Randy the Operator at the beginning of the film. He was in The Man from Alamo in 1953. And then in 1957, he played a police officer in the film I Was a Teenage Werewolf. That same year, he appeared twice in the role as Steve Clay was in a television series, The Man of Annapolis, as a military drama set in the United States Naval Academy. He also appeared in Rod Cameron's drama State Troopers in the episode No Fancy Cowboys, about a defunding of guest and dude rent. But about that same time, the Walt Disney Company was casting Zorro, a television series based on the characters created in 1919 by Johnson Macaulay, the young nobleman Don Diego del Vega, and his masked alter ego, Zorro. To play the main character, and this is all from Wikipedia, the chosen actor would have to be handsome and have some experience with fencing. Walt Disney interviewed Guy Williams. So Walt Disney himself interviewed Guy Williams, telling him to start growing a mustache, neither very long or thick. The executive contract paid Williams the then very high wage of $2,500 per week, equally to $26,049 today. Williams resumed his professional training in fencing with the Belgian champion Fred Clovis. Okay, so that's pretty much the series. Let's see. Fred College, who trained Douglas Fairbank, Errol Flynn, and Tyrone Powell. So that's very big names in fencing or in the silent era films. Acquired sword fencing. Zorro was on the Disney anthology series, the 4th anniversary show, where he challenged the notion that Zorro was a fictional character. He was so that's that was the kind of how he became Zorro. Zorro, the show itself. The show itself was kind of really, like, I guess, Americans' audience first connection with Zorro. For most of the run, Zorro episodes were part of a continuing story arc. So I'm kind of like just wanting to watch so I kind of feel each about 13 episodes long. It had a structure similar to a serial. The first of these chronicles the emergence of Zorro Diego to California in 1820 and his battle with the greedy and cruel local commandant Captain Incre Sanchez Monster View. I'm going to kind of give you sort of the cast. The cast was Don Diego de Vega was played by Guy Williams. Guy Williams was also in, after Zorro, he did a stint in Bonanza in 1964, but he got his resurgence casting in the 1965 television series Lost in Space. And it was his return to television. He played alongside June Lockhart as his wife. June Lockhart was in the film Meet Me in St. Louis. And so that's kind of an interesting, I kind of felt like that was interesting that the guy that played Zorro all those years back in 1957, 10 years later, 12 years later, he became, he was in the, or 8 years, 8 years later, he went back to stardom as Lost in Space. So that was just me doing kind of my own research. Zorro also had its other cast members was Don Alejandro de la Vega, Don Diego's father, played by George J. Lewis. George J. Lewis, Lewis appeared in 2 episodes of The Lone Ranger. He was in Three Stooges film, and he was He played the male lead in the 1944 serial Zorro the Black Whip. So I wonder if they had something to do with casting him as Zorro's father. Lewis appeared in the first 2 episodes of The Lone Ranger, and that's that. So I'm going to kind of look at so Zorro. I'm also going to look at the television series, go through the actors. So there was Guy Williams played Zorro. George J. Lewis, as I said, played Zorro's father. His other roles include he played in Zorro's Black Whip, The Honeymoon Flats. He was in an episode of Family. His last appearance was in an episode of Family Affair in 1969, but he was also in episodes of Get Smart, The Loner, Miami Undercover, Outlaws, and he was in 7 Faces of Dr. Leno, The Life and Legends of Wyatt Earp. His roles went all the way down to a lot of cowboy movies in the 40s. And he was in Oklahoma Blues, The Thrill of Brazil in 1946. And he played in the 1944 movie Captain America, which I think was Captain America's first theatrical release film. But he plays. He died in 1995, but he plays Don Alejandro del Vega, his father. Then you had Bernardo, played by Gene Sheldon. Bernardo is his Don Diego's silent friend and comrade. He was in his other roles include Babes in Toyland in 1961, which he did right after Zorro. He's also known for Susie's Affair and a film called The Dolly Sister. His last role was Howdy. He passed away in 1982. His other roles include Where Do We Go From Here in 1945 and Golden Girl. Then you had Henry Calvin, who played Sergeant Demonto Lopez Gave. He was in Babes in Toyland, Ship of Fools. Let's see, he was in The Man from U.N.C.L.E. in 1966. One episode of Dick Van Dyke Show. Before Zorro, he was in The Brooklyn Star, Crimes Against Joe, and he was in a TV series called The Clock, which was an anthology series and based on an ABC radio play. But he plays kind of the bumbling fool Sergeant Demonte Lopez Garcia. Then you had Don DeMann Corporate Reeves. Don DeMann lived to be about 90, and he was in Dynasty. He kept working till 1987. He was in episodes of LA Law. He was in episodes of... He was in a animated show called The New Adventures of Zorro that lasted 13 episodes. So it was canceled too soon. Then it was it's kind of interesting looking at these actors that they kind of did from Zorro to other versions of Zorro. His other role, then you had George J. Lewis, who played Don Alejandro del Vega, Don Diego del Vega's father. He was in films such as Zorro's Black Whip as Vic Gordon, Malcolm's Place, Raider Patrol versus Spy King. His other roles include Get Smart, The Loner, and I think Family Affair. Let's see. So that's Zorro's father. So that's pretty much the cast. I really want to get into I've talked to 24 minutes. Okay. That's the cast. So let's get into the episode. So the show opens up, which I find kind of interesting, is that the show doesn't really show us Zorro. This is more of the way. This is kind of like Zorro begins, if you will, because the show opens up not in Mexico or California, but at the coast of California, and we find out the year is 1820. And we see a ship, and then we go into and see two men sword fencing. The two men are Senor de la Vega and the captain of the ship. Senor de la Vega we find out that he has been away he's been away for 3 years from California and has been on a long voyage. He tells him that and we kind of get exposition about sort of how he's been on a long voyage. We don't really know what the voyage was like, but the captain tells him that things have changed since you've been gone in 3 years in Los Angeles. He says that military forces have taken over, and that if he has anything of value, he should hide it. So this basically tells us two things. One, that we understand that his hometown is being run by a corrupt government, and we find out that things have kind of been worse in a lot, like the way Batman Begins is, where in Batman Begins, if you remember that scene when Bruce is being taken by Rachel in the car, and Rachel has been saying, Falcone has been taking over. I mean, there's a lot of similarities, and the reason why I'm bringing up Batman is, Zorro is pretty much a big influence on how Batman becomes Batman. If you remember, in a lot of the origin stories, Batman, or young Bruce Wayne sees a Zorro film, and that sort of inspires him to be the Cape Crusader we know and love. But let's go into this, as he says, he talks about how military forces have taken over, that if he has anything of value, he should hide it. And he kind of like talks about how this sort of kind of surprises Del Vega, that things aren't the way it were. Then after kind of knowing this information, he goes down to his quarters on the ship and talks to his servant, Bernardo, his mute servant. Zorro asks Bernardo that for his letters that he needs to burn them. That he also needs, so he needs to have both his letters and burnt and his prized possessions and trophies thrown overboard. Because he needs to make sure that no one knows that of his return, and that he needs to kind of be known as a Commodore. And it's kind of going back to Batman Begins. If you remember in Batman Begins, on the plane from Ra's al Ghul's The League of Shadows area back to Gotham, there's a scene where we see Bruce Wayne on the airplane talking to Alfred about trying to be a symbol, and that I felt like when I was watching this episode that felt like there was a lot of connections to both those two scenes. So he's like, throw out all my possessions. Bernardo starts throwing out all his his trophies and things out into the ocean. And Zorro lets Bernardo be, and then he kind of talks to Bernardo and says, you can be my eyes and ears, and sort of his own personal spy and his, if you will, Robin, that can be kind of sort of his eyes and ears and sort of his ward. And I don't know if maybe in future adventures he and Bernardo and Zorro team up. I would guess that would happen because we see Bernardo wearing sort of the sombrero that Zorro will soon wear. Let's see. He wants letters, but so after wanting his possessions thrown overboard, Zorro wants to burn the letters. He wants to make sure no one expects him to return home, and they need to deal with the tyrant immediately. He disguises himself. He wants to. So it is that Batman Begins, like disguising himself as not a man of action, but a man of sophistication. Basically, the opposite, sort of how Bruce Wayne is sort of, or not the opposite, kind of the same, where he wants to be a man, using a mask. Batman uses a mask. We kind of see that there are a lot of similarities when I watch this scene. And he talks about him being his eyes and ears, and then and what's interesting is that Bernardo says that Bernardo thinks that it's Indians that they should be worried about, and Alejandro or Del Vega says, no, it's not Indians that we have to worry about it's politicos. That the town is being kind of runs politically dirty, if you will, and he says we kind of get the kind of this is where he kind of decides to become sort of a symbol of justice, if you will. and then he says, and then they leave the boat. We don't really see that, but he drives in, or he takes the carriage into town, and as he's going into town, he sees he is actually stopped for inspection. Alejandro says, "We already been through customs, and this doesn't make sense. Why should we stop again?" And this is where we're introduced to I've been through customs and does not want to deal with it again. And this is when we're introduced to one of the guards, and the guard is Garcia. Sergeant Lopez Garcia, and Garcia says, "Oh, Don Diego, how are you?" And he says, This is just he's like, "It's nice to see you again. I heard that you're back," and this sort of flusters Don Diego, because he says, "What is the meaning of all this?" And he says, "It's just a formality." And they kind of go through he says he doesn't want to deal with it again, and he says, "But it's just a formality." And that there's no, but the guard says there's no exceptions are allowed by Captain Monsterio's orders. Don Diego finds out that's the guy who's now kind of been ruling the town a little bit as the commentario. Will tells him that he arrives, and that he makes Commandante is the name, and he says, and Guard Garcia says, he makes the orders, I only carry them out. And then Don Diego says, "Very well, then go get on with it." And so he starts searching his carriage. He then mimes to Bernardo of what's going on, that he's doing his instructions to to kind of go through it, and this sort of confuses Garcia by saying, "What is this sign language that you're doing?" And he finds out that he's instructing him to remove his luggage, and this kind of confuses him, and Garcia says, "So is your servant deaf and dumb?" And then Zorro says, "Yes, from childhood, but he's remarkably good." And then Garcia says, "With your permission, I will tell the Commandante that you have arrived." And he says, "Thank you for that." Then he goes up to Raphael, or let's see, Captain Montestario's office, and tells him that Don Diego has arrived. And captain says, "Well, that's good and everything, but have him wait. I will see him in a moment." And he says, "Very good." And then this sort of questions Lucindo's reasons why Don Diego has returned. And he says, "I don't like it. This just doesn't make any sense." And then Don Raphael says, "What difference does it make, Lucindo? Lucindiando?" And he basically tells us that, as the audience, that the De La Vegas are the most important family here in Southern California. Do you think he was called? And then Lucindo says, "Do you think he was called back for something?" And Captain Raphael is like, "There's nothing to worry about. Even if he was called back, there's nothing to worry about." And he says, "If he's a troublemaker, I shall handle him myself, like I did the others." And then he grabs his sword, and kind of says to himself, "Nothing shall stop me from becoming the richest man in all of California." California. So then, Captain Garcia or Sergeant Garcia tells Don Diego or Zorro, that he will see him in a moment. And Don Diego says, "Would you mind helping me with my massive luggage?" And he says, "Of course." And then we hear a trumpets play and a man being brought in on horseback by two guards. And as they're walking in, as they're walking in, he is. By the way, the Captain Monastrero was played by Eugene Sanchez. He was in Purple Mask, Rawhide, and I Spy. But so going back to the plot, I just was like, "There's my Troy McClure moment." But going back to the plot, we see a man being carried in on horseback, and it's sort of, you see that he is one of the that Garcia tells everyone to clear the streets, that a prisoner's being taking out, and Don Diego, or let's just call him Zorro, looks up and sees that it's his neighbor's not Sergeant, or his neighbor Nacho Torres, and he's like, "Why is he being brought in?" And he's saying, "Well, he was arrested under the order of the Commandante." And then, as Senior Nachos is being carried back to prison, another man comes up and says, asks the guards, "Why have you taken this man prisoner?" And he says he's an innocent man, and that he's been accused of treason, but it's been a lie. He dares to speak out against injustice. And then Don Raphael shows up and says it's forbidden to speak to the prisoners. Don Raphael tells him that it's forbidden to speak to the prisoners and take him inside and locking him up. This sort of angers Don Diego del Vega, and he starts to make a move, and Bernardo sort of stops him and stops him with his hand and says, don't antagonize him. Remember, be a man of scholar. And he said, and then one of the men says, I must protest to Capitan that this man is no criminal. And he basically rubs it off, or Don Diego or Captain Monastrell says, Senor Alcalá, this case is not a civil matter. This is a case. Civil matter. A crime of treason is a military injustice. So we can kind of tell that he's basically kind of using his power to kind of take hold of his military power to kind of rule with an iron fist, if you will.
Comes under military jurisdiction.
And it's a military jurisdiction. He then Raphael talks to Don Diego del Vega, aka Zorro, and they sort of are. He says, "I'm sorry that inconvenienced you," and Don Diego says, "Oh, no worries. Of that, it gives me an opportunity to finish the last chapter of my book." And he tells him that's the effect of Moorish culture on Spanish poetry. So we can kind of tell that he's still kind of playing the facade of a scholarly nobleman as well, and he kind of has to ask him if you read it, and you can kind of tell that Don Don Raphael is not a big fan. Isn't really a big fan of that type of literature. But he's more focused on
Please make yourself comfortable.
talk. He wants to kind of have a talk with him about things, and says, meet me in my quarters. Feel free to kind of relax there before I shall not detain you long. Then Don Raphael's right hand man ask him why did he say why he has returned, and Don Raphael is going to get to the bottom of this and figure out why he has returned. And then we see Bernardo basically kind of turn his head and overhears about kind of what these two are saying, and he tells that the man he talked to, he says, get back to the inn, we should not be seen together. And then he turns away, and then he turns away back to then he turns back and sees Bernardo, and kind of assumes that Bernardo has been listening to Don Raphael's conversation. So he he goes over to him and says, "What are you doing up there? You come down from here." And he kind of says, "I order you to come down here." And he thinks that Bernardo has been spying on him for a while. And then but Sergeant Garcia shows up and says, "Don't worry about it. Don't worry about it. This man cannot hear so he cannot hear. This man is deaf and dumb." And then he's like, and then Don Raphael says, "Is it true? And is it true that he cannot hear? He's deaf and dumb?" And he says, and then Sergeant Garcia says, "Yes, watch this," and says to him that he is, goes on and says, "You are deaf and stupid," and tells him to watch this, and then he waves at Sergeant Lopez waves at Bernardo and says, "You have a face of a donkey," and starts to chuckle. "You smell like a goat. Your father was a baboon." And as he's saying this, Bernardo sort of smiles at him, and nods his head like an idiot. And then he calls him, "Your father was a baboon," and they shake his hand. And then once he realizes that this must be true, he said, Don Raphael tells Sergeant Garcia to get on with the inspection and to inspect carefully. Then Don Raphael walks off and then asks one of the guards, for his weapon. During this time, they're getting both of them are inspecting the carriage. He takes out his gun, shoots it in the air. This startles Garcia, but doesn't startle Bernardo, and he kind of smirks and says, "Okay, carry on with your searching." Then we get to back at Don Raphael's office. We see Don Diego Zorro look out of the window and then quickly run back to his seat where he's looking at the papers with his quill, or reading a book with his kind of leaning on the thing, like looking like he's been reading for all that time. And then he says, "I know," and then he asks him, "I know you've been anxious," or Don Raphael tells him that, "I know you're ready to be home," and how Don Diego's been having sort of a long day, and he's been fatiguing. And Don Raphael says, "Just fill out these applications for me. Fill out these applications for me." Then Don Diego says, "You're coming in. Your return to town has been very unexpected. Your father gave the idea that will you be still at university for another year?" And then Don Diego goes into kind of what's been going on at the university where he's been saying, taking classes in sword fencing and swordsmanship. He says there's an overestimate of swordsmanship and gymnastics. He even kind of says that there were even duels among the students at the school, which seems like a pretty cool, Xavier School for Mutant Abilities kind of thing, if you think about it. Students, and then Don. Wish I could get these characters right. Raphael kind of starts to check out, basically play with Don Diego's sword, and kind of talks about how this Toledo blade slings, and he swipes it, and he cuts off the feather of his quill, and this sort of goes, and there's a look on Don Diego's face that says, "Wow, I can't believe you. How dare you cut off my quill pin?" I'm actually got that paused right now, and he says it sings. Then Don Raphael apologizes to Don Diego. And he says, your father wouldn't forgive me if anything happened to you. Sergeant Garcia comes back and tells him that everything's been searched and looked at, and Captain Monasterio says every trunk and bag. You haven't found anything, I'm guessing, and he's like, Sergeant Garcia is like, no, all I found is pretty much every trunk and bag seemed to be full of books, and he says heavy ones, and he finishes his and then Zorro finishes his signing his papers, and Don Raphael hands his sword to Garcia, and Garcia asks him what do you want me to do with this sword? And he says, hang it in my quarters. And as he's going to do that, he kind of insults him, and then he insults him, and Don Diego kind of sneakily pushes the sword, kind of pokes Don Raphael a little bit, and Don Raphael turns around and goes, "You stupido," and thinks it's Sergeant Garcia that did it. And he says, just go, he gets mad, and he says, just go get my, go put this away as fast as you can. So then Don Diego heads home, and he gets home and is met with his servant, or his, his servants, Juan and Pepito, who is, I guess, people who lives on their property. I don't know. Anyway, so, and he asks him how his father is and has he been taken good care of, and then we're introduced to Don. Let's see. Juan and Pepito taking care of his father. They meet, and they kind of hug and embrace both Don Diego and his father. And he says, "It's been a long time. Come, we have much to discuss. It's time for suppers on the table." So after we've kind of introduced, so after basically we introduced that he has his servants, not servants, but I guess his housemates, and we've introduced that Don Diego has his meets his father, Don Alejandro del Vega, played by George J. Lewis. He says, we have much to discuss, but let's discuss this before we have supper. We don't really see them eat, but they kind of, after dinner, Don Diego starts playing the piano and saying that this is the song of the Vaqueros, and he's kind of very jubilant and jolly about it, and then Don Alejandro del Vega says, "Haven't you been listening to me? Haven't you been listening to me and not interested in what I've told you?" And you can kind of tell that Don Diego is very cocky about the fact that things aren't going as well as they need to be. And he says, "I'm so sorry that things have gone very unpleasant for you, Father." And he says, "Unpleasant," and basically Don Diego spews, or Don Diego, Don Alejandro spews that unpleasant and is intolerable. The rancheros are taxed out of existence. Basically, they who can't pay are sent to prison. The Indians are being forced into slave labor, which is kind of what the slave labor stuff is. It's kind of mentioned, kind of the big plot point in Mask of Zorro. And it's for all the benefits of Captain Monastero. And Zorro says, or Don Del Vega says, "I have met the man. He seems to be a great gentleman," and this sort of angers his father by saying, "Gentleman, that man is a slime." Well, he calls him more of he is a black-hearted scoundrel. If he remains in power, our country faces ruins. And he says, "We must get rid of him, Diego." And he says, "We must get rid of him, Diego. We must. That's why I called you home." And we kind of see that basically they want him to see if maybe his son and Diego can kind of rise up and defeat. And then he thinks, then Diego thinks, what I should do is I should write a letter, and Don Diego, or his father says, "Don't worry about, writing a letter won't solve anything because they'll intercept the letters anyway." Then Don Diego says, he basically says that Don Diego says, I'm going to write a letter. Don Alejandro says it's not going to work. Basically we find out that Nacho's his neighbor tried to protest and ended up thrown in jail. He says, don't we have rights under the law? And he says, Monasterio is the law. He brought a crooked lawyer from Mexico City to make crimes illegal. So we can kind of tell that things aren't going. The government's a little bit corrupt at home, like more corrupt at home, and we get more into details about that. And we see that his father is more. His father is more saying, now that you're home, son, we can stand up and fight the oppression. Or Don Alejandro says, we can fight and stand up the oppression. And Don Diego kind of says, the use of force should be our last resort. And I kind of can tell that, kind of in the same way as Bruce Wayne pretty much says the same thing. He kind of explains that. Violence should be the last resort, and you can kind of tell that he's basically faking it to his father. He doesn't want his father to get involved because this kind of angers his father, and he says, go to bed. I'll go to bed, and then he goes back to his room. At his room, he and Bernardo talk about. He says, and he feels like he's done something that he's not very proud of, and convinced his father that he's a spineless weakling, which he's not. And this is kind of the moment where we kind of get the fact that he is going to be kind of come up with kind of become the fox, or the Zorro, if you will. So this is where he finally will become the Mask of Zorro, where he basically he says, now on I shall be known as Zorro the Fox, and he takes out his sword and that he was fencing with and slices a Z in a piece of paper. And then he kind of, we don't really see him sort of get in a suit, or like kind of him like he kind of probably, in the same way as in Batman the Animated Series, he already has the suit sort of tucked away somewhere, so there's not like, which kind of is interesting with what we saw with in the Mask of Zorro. He got kind of more the costume. He slowly built to the costume. Here, it's like Batman the Animated Series. He just has the costume. So that night, or so that day, he goes and checks out his. That day he goes and up to the mountains, and up to the mountains he finds up to the mountains to see Zorro, or not Zorro, to kind of get to his old horse, Tornado. Not Tornado, but Tornado. Such as in the music sheets, to the black horse known as Tornado. It is his old horse because he says it's been a long time, and talks about the tricks he did for him. And we get to see him do the tricks where I think the trick is he basically the horse will kneel with him, and the horse will kneel for him, and like kneeling, and we kind of and it's kind of just kind of a moment where we kind of get to say, okay, this is how he got his horse. Then, this is how he got his horse. And he says that it was a cult when he left. So I'm guessing he was gone, for probably a couple. He had that horse as a child, and so he goes over to the horse, and the horse just gallops up to him, which is kind of interesting because when you watch the Mask of Zorro, there's this whole scene, which we'll get into, where he basically has to steal Tornado. Like Tornado has been sort of in the governor's shed for a while, and Antonio Banderas' Zorro has to go and rescue it. So, and he's for black and white, this film, he is a beautiful looking horse, kind of a black beauty, if you will. And he kind of shows. He asked him, "What kind of tricks can you do that I taught you?" And he says, "Do you think you can kneel?" And then the horse actually kneels, and then he tells Tornado that they're going for a long ride tonight. Then that night, the nightfall comes, and we see a man, which I think is probably very custom during this time, when I guess a man would come out like at night and sort of say, kind of, curfew is over. It's 10 o'clock. The night, it's 10 I guess the town has like a curfew at 10 o'clock. And he says something like, on a warm summer's night, all is well. And he basically, and then the guards come in with Sergeant Garcia, and leave, and he kind of says, bar the gate and dismiss the guards, leave one on patrol, one patrol saddled. And so we can kind of see that this is sort of everybody's sort of turning in for the night. Turning in for the night that and he says, Sergeant Garcia, and he says all the prisoners are in for the night, and Don Raphael says that leave one, says all, he says bar the gate and don't let anybody in. And then he looks over and sees Mr. Nachos, Zorro's neighbor, kind of in his cell looking out, and he sort of kind of looks at him regretfully, and then Don Raphael goes into his office, and at his office he's asked by his right-hand man about how long he must wait.
Half an hour or so. Why then?
And he tells him just wait about half an hour or so. His lawyer is wondering how must they wait, and Raphael says, "Don't worry, don't worry, everyone will be asleep by then." Sleep, and then the lawyer says something could go wrong. He's like, and the lawyer starts pacing around, and the lawyer gets really nervous, and he says, "Wait in my quarters. Everything will be all right." Then we get to Zorro on the outskirts of town, next to where the wall is, on his horse, carrying another horse actually. Tornado, I think he's riding Tornado and the horse that he had. So he gets Tornado to kind of stand next to the wall, and he gets on the back of Tornado's back and climbs the wall and he kind of climbs off, just like Batman, on rooftops. And as he's on the rooftop, he kind of sneaks like a fox or a Zorro, and he basically crawls and makes sure nobody sees him. Then Senor Torres, then Sergeant Garcia goes over to Senor Torres and basically wishes him good night. And as he's wishing him good night, he tells him to sleep well, and Nachos is basically kind of, he's in prison, so he's kind of sad and everything. And then Zorro goes off the rooftops and grabs a rope and ropes one of the ropes to one of the saddles of the horses, or out of all the horses, to kind of basically stop. Well, you'll see what'll happen next, and then Garcia goes over to Captain Raphael's office and says, all prisoners have been accounted for, and that I'm turning in for the night. And he says, very well, you can turn in for the night. And then this is kind of where we're getting closer to the action scene.
Is the prisoner Torres secure? He's a dangerous man, Sergeant, full of much cunning.
And he says, is prisoner Torres secure?
I will mention you in this report.
And he can kind of, prisoner secure. And he says that he is, and basically tells him that I will mention you in your report, and you can go to bed. But leave your keys on the desk. Then Zorro goes into the prison where he sees Senor Torres, and Senor Torres is like, who's this masked figure? And he says, I'm a friend. I come to help you. But how can you help me? I'm chained like an animal. And Zorro asks where the keys are, and he says Sergeant Garcia has them. And Sergeant Garcia will relieve him of him.
Now, in a little while, you will take the keys and release the prisoner. But only suspect something. Will a lawyer?
And then he said, then they're going. Then we see Don Raphael and his lawyer. Basically, they're going to try to frame Nachos as a frame Nachos as a frame Nachos and basically give a chance to actually execute him and give the alarm. And he said, I'll be waiting right here, and he's got a gun for him. And then he's basically made a false report that he says that a fugitive shot while attempting to escape. So we can kind of see that they're actually going to put him up to frame him. Then we see Zorro take the keys from Captain Garcia, and Garcia starts. It's kind of funny. He's like singing and taking off his shoes, and then Zorro points a sword to his back and tells him that, where are the keys. He says, I don't know where the keys are. The keys, where's the prisoner's keys? And he says the commandante has the keys. And then he says, I just gave them to him. And then Zorro tells him to get up and stand in a corner. And he ends up putting the sword, kind of placing the sword on a chair next to his back. And then he tells him to go to the corner of the room. He puts a bag on over Zorro puts a bag over Sergeant Garcia's head, and Sergeant Garcia's like, you're not gonna kill me, are you? And he says, and then he's, not unless you move, I'll be standing right behind you. He places the sword on a stool closer to his back. And he says, I'll be standing right behind you. And then we basically see him make his way with the keys to the prison. But he kind of has to hide because he hides because one of the men goes and frees him, because they're about to frame Senor Torres anyway. And he says, why are you releasing me now? Senor Torres says that, and you have signed an acquisition as discovered the charges against you were false. And Zorro shows up and points the sword at the sergeant and says, I have, thank you so much for, basically freeing the prisoner, that you kindly solved a problem for us.
You have most kindly solved the problem.
And he says, don't cry, don't scream. And he tells Senor Torres to put the shackles on the lawyer, and they basically lock him up. Meanwhile, after they kind of lock him up, Sergeant Raphael is basically waiting he's still thinking that he's going to blackmail Nacho's Torres's, and so they, and it's he doesn't hear anything, and it kind of makes it feel impatient, him impatient, and then Nachos is kind of like, who is this masked man? And Zorro says, a friend of the people, El Zorro. And then he slices a Z in the wall, carves a Z in the wall. Don Diego goes and shoots the prisoner to make the escape, not knowing that Zorro is with him. So he starts shooting at Zorro, and he misses. Don Rafael misses and shoots, misses the shot, and then Zorro and Don Rafael, they swashbuckle and do a sword fight. Clack, 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 clack. And, we can kind of see, it's really kind of cool looking sword fighting. And we see that Don Rafael is saying, Sergeant Garcia, where are you? I need backup. Sergeant Garcia. We know that Garcia's has the sword and a bag over his head, and he's still screaming for Sergeant Garcia. Garcia, and we see kind of like him fight, and they put him. Don Diego puts him in, or Don Raphael puts Zorro in a corner. Zorro kind of gets out of the corner, and then Sergeant Garcia finally hears his name. He stumbles out of his bag and takes the bag off his head, finding out that there was nobody there. And then they kind of are still. Garcia sees Raphael and Zorro sword fight. Raphael lunges his sword at Zorro. It gets stuck in the wall. It's a brick wall. I don't know how that's possible, but let's go with it. And then he basically gets he basically, with the upper hand, Zorro forces Raphael into the prison, or to the jail cell. And then Sergeant Garcia, stumbling, trying to get his shoes on while he's coming out with his sword to fight Zorro. He says, I'm coming, and they fight. But he's kind of, I've noticed that Sergeant Garcia is very kind of the funny aloof, Zorro the fox, and so they fight. And as they're fighting, he's kind of I've noticed that when Zorro and Garcia fight, it's very kind of humorous. Like, Garcia's kind of got a look on his face that he is sort of kind of shocked and awe. And then we see that Raphael is saying, Garcia, idiota, pick up your sword and fight. And then Zorro gets kind of the overhead and pushes Garcia close to the well, and Garcia falls in the well. The guards stumble to get their weapons and uniforms on. They wake up and they're stumbling to catch Zorro while Captain Raphael is screaming, "Get them! Get them! Get them! Get him! Get him! Get him!" And then Zorro climbs a bunch of boxes. As he's climbing a bunch of boxes, he throws some of the boxes over. This causes a sort of windfall of boxes that sort of makes the soldiers, fall down. He gets on the rooftop again, and he tells him, and then Garcia screaming in the jail cell to get to their horses. He must not escape. And then to the horse. So the guards get into their horses, not knowing that Zorro has tied their horses together. They try to make a leap for it, but they all are thrown off their horses, and Sergeant Garcia yells at them to open the gate, and then they untie the horses and head out to face him. Meanwhile, Zorro runs out far away to Garcia and says, and Garcia's like, "I don't know who you are, but Senior Zorro, but I owe you my life." And you see Zorro kind of doing kind of a smile, and says, "I will never forget you. I owe you my life." And he says, and he kind of nods and heads out, and we kind of get the conclusion of the episode. So that was And then we get sort of the conclusion of the episode where he kind of walks out in the moonlight. And then we hear the Zorro, Zorro, Zorro. And then we get sort of what's going to happen next week. So that was Zorro, the television series, first episode of the television series. I had to kind of explain a little bit of the kind of the plot and stuff, but I liked it. I felt like it was a really good first episode. It kind of had to go through origin story stuff. Just, I felt like this, being the first episode, you had to go through the origin of how Zorro becomes Zorro. But now that we've kind of mowed that lawn, now the fun's about to begin. I feel like, for a black and white show, I could kind of see why kids, really got into this show back in the 60s, and I can kind of see where this show is. So I'd give this episode, as a pilot, I'd give it a 9. Join me in the next few times. This is going to be for part 2 of Zorro, and we're going to go talk about the mask of Zorro. Here we go.